Gary, thank you so much. And now I will turn the mic over to my friend and the president of the Fund for Peace, Paul Turner. Paul, thank you.
Thank you, James, and thanks everyone for taking some time out to discuss and embrace a really key issue that I think needs a lot more attention on the global stage. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, or night, depending on where you are around the world. I'm excited to share a few thoughts today and pleased to discuss nonviolence with you and how we at the Fund for Peace use research and data to identify ways that we work with local civil society organizations, governments, multinational corporations, religious leaders and faith-based communities and/or bilateral or multilateral donors to prevent, mitigate, and transform conflict in order to decrease the levels or just the risk of violence. We've developed a tool that is free for all to use called the Fragile States Index. We are increasingly reliant on a new tool that we will launch in November that we are creatively referring to it as the Resilient States Index to understand where countries are on a spectrum that spans from positive peace to war. We're seeking not just to see an end to physical violence, but to also see an end to the structural and cultural violence that is rife around the world. Often we will take this national level understanding that the Fragile States Index provides and translate it to local levels, and have done so for some different organizations ranging from investment banks to a civil society in the Niger Delta called PIND. We think that it's important to not just assume that the dynamics that occur at the national level translate down or trickle down to the state, community, or even household level, and that it's key to make sure that the understandings that we are underpinning our activities, our support to different communities are really based on what's taking place there. The tool that I'll walk you through in just a minute provides insights as to the risks of violence and what may be acting as underlying factors. At the end of the presentation during the Q&A session, I'll just have a couple of slides in the background that can provide some guidance around ways to engage, to prevent violence, or to mitigate the violence that may already exist. Having said that, on the slide in front of you, you'll see kind of a nice multicolored portrayal of the world. And so that's basically meant to indicate kind of the degrees of fragility that take place. Our tool measures fragility, not resilience, and that's why I mentioned we're releasing another one soon. We also look at structural vulnerabilities and pressures. It takes place at the national level, like I mentioned, and I'll walk through 12 indicators in just a couple of slides that you can see later. It's global in scope, and this was the 17th year that we've conducted this. So we've been able to go from kind of a one-year snapshot to really being able to have some rich understandings of what the current trends are in countries around the world. Next slide, please. So why does it matter? There's the obvious challenges in the country, but if we're based in the United States or Cameroon or Cambodia, for that matter, why should we care what's happening in other countries around the world? So in our own country, there's obvious things that are contributing to fragility, whether those are issues of poverty, human rights violations, or what have you. But often we see fragility have a contagion effect. So it spreads not just from the corner that it may be located in within a country, but across that country, and it's certainly not limited by borders. And so we see everything from population outflows, refugee crises, transnational criminality, the spread of pandemics, which is something that I think we're all particularly affected by the last few years, and the increase in transnational conflict as other actors are drawn into the arena. Next slide. Here's a list of the indicators that we use. It sounds really nice, and it's good to have it all boiled down to a green or a red color, but we're literally moving through thousands of data points as we're developing the index and trying to find ways that we can take all of that information and package it in a way that is palatable is a real challenge. And so there are 12 indicators. I'll go through them really quickly, and sorry to read directly off the slide, but it's a security apparatus, factionalized elites, group grievances, economic decline, uneven development that hits societies in different ways, human flight, issues of state legitimacy, public services, human rights and the rule of law, demographic pressures, refugees and IDP, and a cross-cutting indicator, which is focused on external intervention. Now, on the next slide, you'll see how these are all grouped. So we put them into kind of 5 major categories. I mentioned the cross-cutting one, but others are grouped into indicators focused on cohesion, others looking at political issues, economic indicators, and social indicators. There are obviously thousands of different ways that you can slice and dice data, and different indices use different means of doing so. This one works for us and isn't in radical defiance of the thinking that anyone else has out there around the world, but it works for us, and we've been able to use it over the 17 years, and it's been unchanging, and that makes part of it, that's part of the reason why it's so valuable, is that we've been able to provide kind of reliable and consistent access to data over time. Next slide, please. So what kind of information are we pulling? We're getting structural data and event-driven data. For those of you that do much analysis, you may recognize some of the different data sets that we're using. One that's really commonly used and has just kind of increasingly become embraced by the conflict prevention and response community is ACLED, but we use annual reports that are generated by groups like the UN, by specific countries, by different NGOs, et cetera. We do a lot of content analysis with Boolean searches based around targeted phrases that we've refined. And then we also have a qualitative review, because we, as well as I think most others that are working on really trying to understand the nuances of conflict and violence, have discovered that data in and of itself isn't helpful without the ability to contextualize it. And so we have experts that are involved in that. Next slide, please. So with the quantitative data, we collect it, normalize it, scale it, and then start to bucket it into those series of indicators that you saw earlier. We obviously look at some of the data and feel like it's not appropriate, either because it's no longer relevant, it's dated, we don't feel like it's particularly reliable or targeted at the right issues. And so there's a little bit of an art there, even though for the most part, this part of the development of the index is heavier on data science. Next slide. With our content analysis, I'd mentioned the Boolean searches earlier. There are 45 different search strings. We cover more than 270,000 different news sources, so a lot of data is being pulled in. And this helps us really understand kind of the direction as to what's taking place in country. Next slide. And I know I'm moving fast, but these will be available later. I just want to try and save a little bit of time for some back and forth at the end. So for the qualitative discussion, we've got independent researchers that are identified that have expertise on the countries at hand. They conduct a high-level review of the major events, and basically as simple as kind of a thumbs up, thumbs down, or thumbs sideways. Like, are things getting better, worse, or about the same as last year? And so that way we can not only look at the numeric indicator that we've given under a particular indicator, but also see if there's a trend that we might be able to notice over time. Next. And so what principles do we have that underpin our work? Really emphasizing that nobody out there has a crystal ball as to what's going to happen. This is really meant to present an understanding of what's taking place now. And it's not prognostic, that we're looking at the pressures. And that's why we took the additional step this year of starting to develop an index that's focused on resilience, because understanding fragility doesn't necessarily help you understand what the country's ability is to withstand shocks. And so we don't know by looking at the Fragile States Index what that country can do, what its capacities and capabilities are. We see this now after 17 years as being a really dynamic tool. Obviously, the first year is quite static, and really, I think over time have seen that to be the real value. If you look at any specific year, it's helpful and there's some rich insights that can be gained, but looking at it over time, it's much more valuable. And then again, we're looking at indicators and not totals. So we're not necessarily embracing a truth, and those indicators are presented kind of on a Likert scale. Next. So a low FSI score, which means it tends to not be seeing high levels of fragility, does not necessarily equal resilience. The overall level of pressure across those 12 indicators is what it does tell you, and also can illustrate short and long-term trends. What it's not telling you is how a country will face a pandemic, a civil war, a terrorist attack, a famine, etc. And why is that? And it's because of the compounding and cascading effects that have to be factored in. We've been working with an organization called SAS Analytics that's able to introduce shocks and design algorithms around our data to anticipate what things might look like in the future. Again, it's not meant to predict the future, but to present a potential trajectory and to be able to use that as the decision-making tool by both policymakers and practitioners. And that's why we're believing that this new complement is going to make all of our research that much more valuable in addressing the violence that exists out in the world. Next slide. So what? So why are we bothering to look at all these numbers, the thousands of them that exist around the world? It's so we can understand fragility to help us break the cycle of just constantly reacting. It puts us in a position where we can be proactive in preventing violence. Fund for Peace has been working with data to build early warning and response systems, and leveraging the index as a departure point for the work that we do. We've done that kind of both at the community level, as well as working at the international level and working with regional and multilateral organizations. I think too often the international community and even local actors are involved in conducting assessments that end up sitting on a shelf. And I've been just as guilty as the next with that, and also are developing monitoring and evaluation indicators that look spectacular, but ultimately just end up having us check a box. And so the more that we're able to encourage people to take rich data and have that be the foundation of a dynamic system that can start to provide those warning signals about the escalating tensions within society, so that we can get ahead of conflict and violence and begin to embrace nonviolent interventions that can head off a real flare of a violent outburst. I think the better off that we'll be. Maybe if we can shift to the next slide. I just want to make sure. Okay. And one more slide after that. And I think now I was trying to move as fast as I could, like I said, so we could have a little bit of time for discussion. I hope everybody's not left kind of gaping with gaping mouths as you're trying to process a bunch of random things that have been thrown at you on a weekend. This slide here talks about a number of different strategic approaches to state fragility. I'm happy to make this deck available afterwards and can send that to anybody who would like it. And it just shows, I think, that the international community has been recognizing the importance of these issues over time. And I realize that you can't see my cute and adorable face while we're talking, so I may ask that the slides go down, and at the very end, I'll flash up one more slide that presents some illustrative interventions based on some good research that's taken place that Brookings used to capture. All right, sorry for the whirlwind, and thanks everybody for your patience. I don't know that I have any wonderful insights to offer, but I'd be happy to explore some ideas together. Or also take on constructive criticism, or just downright harsh criticism as well, if you have some that you're sitting on and trying to figure out whether or not that'd be appropriate.
Paul, thank you so much again. Does anyone have an immediate question, comment, concern? Feel free to raise your hand. Mariam, maybe we have something from the chat.
So a question that we got is, how have governments reacted to this tool, the analytical tool? Does it help give ideas on policy responses, or just kind of the response that you guys have seen from governments with this tool and their utilization of it?
It's a great question, and I think that there's both positive and negative responses to that. So the way that we hope governments or anybody would react is to recognize the opportunities to engage in order to address issues of fragility and to be able to start to work to build cohesion, to address human rights violations or whatever the case may be that are creating those concerns. That's obviously not always the case. We have had governments push back and work to discredit what we've released. In some countries, we've seen an immediate eruption after the release of the latest year's research, as both sides, whether those sides are political in nature or across ideological divides, will use it to grasp at criticisms they try and lob at their opponents. So I think that there's a concern here, and that it at times can be used for at least ill intentions. Overall, though, we've found that because it is rooted in hard, cold data and evidence, there's not a lot of ground to stand on when people do try and criticize the results themselves. That has often led to conversations where we have provided trainings to different governments around the world in what is it that they're looking at, what's the stories that they can understand. And they then take that forward and began to go into conversations around what some of these things are not the way that we would like our country to look, and how can we start to address those. Rarely, but occasionally, we've been asked to provide support and expertise kind of to facilitating those discussions. Those decisions are not ours to make, obviously, but we can make recommendations around lessons learned and good practice based on what other countries have done globally. It also can be a helpful tool for governments. One of the more encouraging things I've seen the U.S. government can do lately in regards to our efforts in foreign affairs is the passage of the Global Fragility Act. And this was used to inform the identification and selection of the pilot countries that the interagency is using to test a new approach that is more long-term, more emphasizing partnership and really trying to help us break some of the cycles of the way that our foreign assistance sometimes undermines its own good intentions. So I'll end it there. Happy to go into some further detail, but there may be other questions that people have as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's great and extremely insightful, especially recognizing the spectrum of responses that you get on these results. So I see that we have a hand up and some questions in the chat. So let's go to Huston first. If you want to unmute and speak and share your question.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me now?
You're coming through clearly.
Yes.
Okay, I don't know, I put the video on. I want to recognize okay, my name is Houston Lako. I'm originally from South Sudan, Juba. I would like to recognize the effort and the work of Brother James. James, hi, how are you? Yeah, good to see you again. Last time we met in DC, 2016 and June, I visited your office and you gave me some a lot of stuff to read and so forth. So hopefully
we'll see what a different world, right?
Yes. Hopefully our food will cross together in near future with this COVID and so forth. Yeah, that's one thing I would like to recognize that. And I don't know if I've been back to South Sudan or not, but I just have some question to put in, just food for thought. What is with regard to the human rights, whose human rights are we talking about? Especially now in this world, this crazy world, we see Ukraine is happening. We have seen Afghanistan, where we withdrew from Afghanistan. A lot is going around. Then number two is the question of the image of Christianity is tainted by deliberate false information to advance the selfish interests of the missionaries, some missionary societies. Like, for instance, let's take the image of Jesus Christ. Was Jesus a white person, a European? Historically, we know it is not the case. Maybe before we start talking about the differences in religion and the fight who's right and who's wrong, maybe we need to re-educate ourselves in some of the information that was presented to a lot of globally with some churches. Remember, some churches are part of the colonial system. They presented a narrative which tainted Christianity to be a religion of the West, Westernization of the Christianity. And now today we have something called commercializations of religion, which is the prosperity gospel and so forth. I think those are some of the issues that actually divide us, not to come to a kind of what is our common interest. Instead of focusing on the message of Jesus Christ for peace and love and so forth, now these false narratives are not even corrected. It's still some denomination is still believe that Jesus is European, which is not the case. So I will leave it to everybody just to think about it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think your first question is a good one, and it's become an increasingly sensitive one over time. When we ask ourselves, like, whose human rights are we talking about? So for our index, we look, and this answer applies a little bit to both points that you raised, but we look to triangulate all the information that we have. So we evaluate the validity of all the resources that we use. And so we find our ability to criticize the West just as easy to criticize any other parts of the world. Not this year, but the previous year, I believe the United States was the country that had dropped most precipitously out of the entire index. And this year it was among the top 10, I believe. And so some of those reasons were because of human rights issues, and a number of other justifications as well. So I think we do our best to hold a mirror up to ourselves and the rest of the world, because we can't find a way forward until we recognize who and what we are. I think your next piece around false information and misrepresentation of information, it actually linked back to something I think one of some topics that the previous speaker had identified, and James had pressed around a good question, which is what do you do when the religious texts aren't used in ways that maybe everyone doesn't agree with? And I think that there's some of these issues that at the end of the day don't necessarily matter that much. And that's my own personal belief, because if someone resonates well with a Buddha or a Christ figure or Muhammad, and they have 3 horns or 1 leg or a purple, but that is their spiritual journey, then I hope that they're able to grow and connect and engage with others in a manner that shows kind of the teachings that exist behind that image. But I do think that there are issues of cultural respect and recognition that play an important role here. And when there's an intentional or unintentional co-option of the narrative of that religious heritage and teaching, that often needs to be confronted by an open and honest conversation. I can share just my personal story really quick. And that's, I grew up in a small town up in the mountains in Tennessee. Every picture that I saw of Jesus was white. When I went to South Central LA for the first time, I went to a religious kind of youth after school center that was set up. And Jesus was there with long flowing dreadlocks and as black as you can imagine. Also not looking very Middle Eastern, and probably was as far from that image as the white one that I grew up with. And I'm sure that there are images of Christ that differ, just as I've seen dozens of different portrayals of the Buddha as I've moved through parts of Southeast Asia. And so I think that the challenging part is, how do we have that conversation to talk about the importance of culture and the importance of respect that is hung up in something as simple as a shade or a color or a hairstyle or whatever the case may be. And then what are those deeper truths that are getting clouded by our immediate and gut instinctive reaction? Because I know that nice generic white Jesus that sat in my Sunday school room really spoke to a lot of people in my community. But I also know that if we were able to sit down and have a long conversation, which sometimes isn't easy to embark on, that they would have been interested to learn about the history of Christ. And what that means, and how that's taken the power and influence of some people away to have that portrayal that they're so comfortable with. So I think that these issues are rich and unfortunately very prevalent as we move around the world, that they're often leveraged to divide us, and that the more that we're able to step back and find ways to identify bridging opportunities, the better off that we'll be, because that opportunity to hold that open conversation that's rooted in our individual truths can offer those pathways to nonviolent interactions.
Paul, thank you very much for that very, very carefully
Yeah.
articulated response to what can be a challenging question about how we see the images and doctrines within our faith and how they relate to our own identity. In the Christian tradition, I always loved it was St. Francis of Assisi who said, I believe, I evangelize all the time, but only use words when necessary. You know, it comes back to how we treat one another in many, many ways, right? But thank you so much, Kristen. It's good to see you. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and step in and hand the mic